This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. I have another archival episode for you today, and this one features a conversation with Emily Joy Allison, author of the book Church 2, as well as the founder of the Church 2 hashtag. I wanted to release this episode again because of the conversations that continue to come up within spaces that cover evangelicalism and life within evangelical circles and life beyond evangelical circles like this one. Within the last week, we've seen Matt Chandler go on indefinite leave due to slipping into someone's DMs on Instagram. Chandler is one of the lead pastors of the Village Church, a large Texas Southern Baptist church, and it also, even earlier this month, settled with an abuse victim while also claiming that there was no wrongdoing involved. The issues of abuse within churches is decades long, and the reason why I'm sharing this again is because of the very fact that so many of the aspects of evangelicalism that we see over and over again are because these institutions refuse to change, because they are more interested in protecting their shepherds than protecting their flock. And I don't really have anything pithy to say about it. It's heartbreaking, the number of people who suffer in those spaces because of those choices. Emily Joy Allison is a leading voice in this cause, in this particular topic, and I want to share her words again. And I will have new episodes here shortly. I have some new interviews scheduled for next week that will begin to hit the airwaves. Just a very busy late summer on my part. So enjoy this archival episode, and I will talk to you soon. Hello and welcome to Evangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. This week it's my pleasure to bring you this interview with Emily Joy Allison, who is returning to the show for the third time to discuss her new book, Church 2, How Purity Culture Upholds Abuse and How to Find Healing. I'm also joined by my friend Amy Congdon as a special co-host. I'll leave the full intro for the interview you'll hear in a moment, but please be sure to check the show notes for links on where to buy Emily's book, which is out on March 9th, 2021. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at brchastain and follow the show on Instagram at evangelicalpod. You can support the show by leaving a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and by subscribing to my newsletter, The Post-Evangelical Post, at postevangelicalpost.com. There are some really exciting things in the works, so please keep an eye on this space. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. Thank you very much, Jake. All right, let's get into it. My guest today is Emily Joy Allison, who's returning to the show for the third time. Emily is a poet, yoga teacher, and author of the book Church 2, How Purity Culture Upholds Abuse and How to Find Healing. I'm also joined today by Amy Congdon. Amy is a clinical mental health counselor in the Kansas City, Missouri metro area, and she comes to this work with a passion for addressing the needs and concerns of those who hold marginalized identities and have experienced trauma as a result of these identities. She's also someone who grew up deeply invested in the evangelical church and purity culture, and now provides care to clients who have experienced religious trauma and seek to find healing from those wounds. Emily, welcome to the show.
Welcome to me, I guess. Thank you for having me back. You said it was like the third time, and I was like, oh God, I guess it is the third time. Like, it's wild that we've been on these like parallel journeys for so many years.
Yeah, that's true. And Amy, welcome to the show for the first time.
Thanks for letting me be here.
I'm really excited to talk to both of you, and congratulations, Emily, on the publication of your book. It's very exciting and will be a wonderful addition to this growing body of literature on purity culture.
Thank you.
I'd love to start by giving some context to Church 2. We actually talked within a month of probably you writing the initial thread that led to the beginning of the Church 2 movement. And that's in the feed for people to find it, and I will link it in the show notes as well. But if you could just share a little bit about how you decided to share that story of your abuse publicly, and then the initial reaction to it as a place for us to start our conversation.
Yeah. So my story of abuse was something that I held on to from the time it happened for about 10 years, which is somewhat surprising. I think anybody that knows me or has followed me online for any significant period of time knows that like I'm a pretty straightforward person and I will talk about almost anything on the internet, right? Like I will talk about my mental illness. I will talk about my sex life. Like I'll talk about anything. But this was something that I had not talked about and something that I had kind of held close to the chest. And part of that was because I just didn't really know what to make of it. It was a very like weirdly traumatizing thing that happened to me. But in my mind, I think survivors more broadly speaking, and women particularly, are sort of conditioned to self-gaslight and, be like, well, it wasn't that bad. And somebody else had it worse. And so, that was kind of like my journey for about 10 years was thinking like, should I talk about this? Well, it wasn't really that bad, right? Like all these other people that I know about had things that I thought were way worse, way more traumatizing, now we'll probably talk about it later, but trauma is relative, right? Like it's if your body finds it traumatizing, but just as a lay person thinking about those things, and in the recovery process, I was like, I don't know if I have anything to be complaining about, basically. And so I just sort of held on to this story. And it wasn't, I talked to therapists about it. I would talk to like my close friends. It wasn't like a deep, dark secret or anything. Like I told people about it, but I had not I didn't talk about it out loud with the same ease that I talk about a lot of other things publicly. And so, so I had just kind of held on to this. And I had written an essay and like submitted it for an anthology, but like it got rejected. So then I was like, I don't really know what to do. So I just, it was sort of just hanging around. And then the Me Too movement started going viral. And of course, now we know that Tarana Burke has been working and organizing under the banner of Me Too for well over a decade at this point. But November of 2017 was when that Me Too movement was starting to go viral on social media. And people who were not necessarily familiar with Tarana Burke's work were also picking it up and running with it. And then it sort of just became this whole, it's a little cliche at this point, but this big cultural moment that we are having right now. So the Me Too movement started. And I was like, oh, like I have this weird, unique, like traumatizing story also. But I also knew, a lot of times the ways that abuse is perpetuated and justified in religious spaces is a little bit different than how it's perpetuated and justified in non-religious spaces. So I mean, I say this, all the time, this is like my line, but like, you don't see Harvey Weinstein justifying his actions with like a chapter and a verse from the Bible. But you do see pastors doing that. And so there's like some specific layers to this conversation that I think deserve to be dealt with and added, which is why I think it's good to have, a separate but adjacent conversation to Me Too about it. Just because some of the factors are so unique, but
right.
But yeah. So there was one week where one guy got accused and then another guy got accused. And then there was like a third guy. And I was just like, I reached a breaking point that week. And I was like, I know that I have this thing that I want to say about this, but like, I don't know if anybody's going to pay attention, but I feel like I need to say it because like these guys just keep getting away with it. So then I was like, let me out my abuser on Twitter. And that's what I like texted my group chat that night. And I was like, should I out my abuser on Twitter? Like, is that what I should do with my evening? And very supportive friends. So I made that thread. And really, that evening, people were responding to it, like friends, mutuals, people that I had followed on Twitter, for years. There was conversation happening and stuff, but I did not nearly expect, the aftermath of it. Like I was like, oh, we'll have a good conversation about this, but I mean, it was viral by the next morning and has continued to be every single day since. I mean, every day there's new tweets, new allegations, and even if it's old allegations, people just using it to share new thoughts and like, it every single day there are people using that hashtag to talk about their feelings about what has happened to them. And it's a weird thing to say about something that is so, sad and traumatizing, but I feel very lucky to be a part of that. And to have something that was so, harmful and traumatizing to me almost be like compacted into a little diamond, and like turned into something that is liberating, not just for me, but for other people, for strangers, people I don't even know. It's kind of incredible.
I'm sure that's definitely sort of wild to see, because when you do a hashtag, it takes on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. Sure does.
It's not something that you can necessarily control, but it is something that is this weird sort of artifact that allows people to have these shared conversations or are connected by this really small thing.
Well, hashtag evangelical. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, I'm sure that there are folks that have discovered it that don't know your story, but you put this out into the world and it became something larger, which is pretty wild. What was it like taking all of those experiences, which are very online, and then developing a book around it? Because I think that's a big transition. So just in the process of writing this book, how did you take all of those sort of experiences that you had and then, format it into a book-length type of treatise?
Yeah. It is a big difference because you're going from 140 characters to 68,000 words.
Yeah.
So kind of a different medium. To be honest with you, all of the credit for the structure of the book goes to my absolutely brilliant fiance, Caitlin Stout, who many people follow on Twitter. Also, she's great. But early in the book writing process, I had sort of the proposal for the book drafted up for a while, but early in the book writing process, like when I was starting to get that proposal in front of actual editors, I sat down with Caitlin and we were talking about like, how should I structure this? Like, what do you think? And the way that I ended up structuring it is very sociological in nature. And she has a degree in sociology. And so there's no surprise. That all of the way the chapters are is, all Caitlin because she's brilliant. But I structured the book by theology, by theological category, right? So I was thinking to myself, okay, what constitutes purity culture, right? If I was going to line up the theologies like a column, like columns holding up, maybe like I'm thinking in my mind of like one of those ancient Greek temples, right? Like the columns holding up the building. What are those columns? What are those pillars? And so those are things like modesty. Those are things like abstinence only. Those are things like complementarianism. Those are things like institutionalized homophobia, or what some call non-affirming theology, quote unquote, right? So I took all of the pieces that I see to be, constitutive of the problem of church too, and used each chapter then to kind of explore why. And that's the thing. I mean, I feel like a broken record so much of the time, but that is the thing that I have been hammering on since the beginning of church too. It's not just bad men. It's not just abuse. It's the theology. It's the ideology. It's like the purity culture behind all of this.
Right.
And I most of the time, I really feel like a lot of people don't want to hear that, right? Like a lot of people don't want to have to, adjust or change their theology, particularly their sexual theology, because we have so much pathology about the body in Western Christianity that we have made it so that our sexual theology is like equivalent to orthodoxy. And so it's very threatening for people to want to do that.
I really appreciated the way in which and Amy, please chime in if you have any thoughts or at any point. I really did like that you used that sort of theological structure in order to dive into this, because of the fact that so much of purity culture, it is like, and evangelicalism in general and purity culture being part of it, they're all overlapping all of these different things. Complementarian theology upholds the ways in which churches handle abuse and all of these different things. Let's start with one of those things, which is the most common sort of terminology that we use when we discuss issues relative to church too, which is purity culture. What's the working definition that you use within the book to define the different characteristics of purity culture and how they enable abuse and harassment?
Yes. Okay, so this is the thing I've been working on for a really long time. This is my elevator pitch. It is very wordy still, but there's a lot to fit into it, right? So I would define purity culture. A lot of people define purity culture like, oh, it's just like chewed gum metaphors, or like those weird dances where the girls put on white dresses and like go with their dad. It can be those things. It can be. That can be part of it. But ultimately, purity culture is the culture created by the theologies that teach that the only acceptable framework for any kind of sexual experience whatsoever is a legal monogamous marriage between a cisgender heterosexual man and a cisgender heterosexual woman for life or else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what the or else is gonna, that your mileage is gonna vary there depending on your community, right? Because some communities, some churches are going to tell you, or else you will get an STI and get pregnant, or else God will be mad at you, or else your future spouse will be very disappointed in you, or else you will burn in hell forever, right? There's a whole range of carrots on sticks, but there's always an or else. There's always like a threat hanging over the head to like ensure compliance. And all those pieces are important, right? You take, there's a lot of people who look at that and they're like, well, I think it's okay to have sex before marriage, but you just have to be monogamous still. Or I think it's okay to be gay. You just have to wait until marriage, or like all of these things, right? And all of that is actually, it's just a lot of pillars that hold up that house of purity culture, right? All of that is a part of it. That's not really fun for people to hear, but that is my definition.
Very, very accurate.
Yeah. It makes me think of the way in which you talk about the idea of consent and how it's absent within purity culture and in a lot of these other elements of what builds up and holds up purity culture. Why is that lack of consent so essential in order to maintain purity culture within these organizations? I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying this is what happens.
Yeah. No, it's
yeah,
it's part of it. I think consent is feared, glossed over, ignored, however you want to say it in purity culture, for a few reasons. One of which is that consent is based on the idea, obviously. I mean, this is like 101, but consent is based on the idea of choice. And in purity culture, you don't have a choice. Right? And you're not supposed to have a choice. I mean, they tell you, oh, you get to freely choose to be abstinent as an act of obedience towards God. But like, there's no free choice that can be made, with a metaphorical gun to your head. That's not how that works. That precludes the possibility of good moral reasoning. If you're being forced, right? And so because consent is so based in choice is a very threatening thing for purity culture, right? Because consent is not just about the yes, it's also about the no, right? Consent is about the idea that you should be able to say yes to the sexual experiences that you do want to have, and no to the sexual experiences that you don't want to have. And teaching people to say yes and no to the experiences they do and don't want to have is a very threatening thing. I mean, not just to purity culture, but just to the larger project of like white evangelical Christianity in general. Both with regards to sex and also in regards to other issues. And all these things are so connected, right? Like, it's never just about sex. It's never just about the body. Like, and so yeah, I think consent is a very threatening idea. And I say this in the book, but I really think, the idea in purity culture to me is not really to get young people to say no, right? It's not really about getting young people to say no, because if you teach young people to say no, right, that is teaching young people to hold a boundary, to hold a personal boundary. When you start holding boundaries, then you start to think you're worth something, right? When you start holding boundaries, then you're like, wow, I'm a person. I can say yes and no to what I want. I have value. I have worth. No, that's not what it's about. In purity culture, the idea is to get young people to say nothing. It's not about getting them to say no. It's about getting them to say nothing. And that is, I mean, I'm assuming we're going there, but that's step one for how purity culture upholds abuse. Is because it disciples people to say nothing.
Right. Yeah, it definitely feels like this thing where we're talking about it all the time. It's something that is preached from every aspect of the church as an institution. And yet then if you're not one of the people doing the instruction, you are to remain silent about it, follow along. And so then it flies under the radar. And I think that's one thing that I see a lot in my work with people who have had experience with purity culture, is they're so surprised as they kind of delve into this, of all of these things that pop up that have always been there that they weren't aware of. And I'm curious, and you're, going into all of the theology and thinking about all the things you've learned and maybe rediscovering some things, like, was there anything surprising that you came back across that you were like, oh, wow, this is
in the process of writing the book?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's less for me. And, Caitlin and I both grew up very evangelical. But our roommate, is like grew up like cradle liberal Lutheran. And so like there'd be sometimes I'll be like talking about this thing that I'm writing for the book, or I'm doing my edits, and I'm like, remember this? And our roommate is just like standing in the corner, like mouth just completely agape, looking at us like, what? I have never heard of this, right? Which I think is like, yeah, it's when you've been out of it long enough. I don't know. I mean, the topic of like deconstruction is like very popular right now. I started deconstructing in like 2010. So like I've been out of evangelicalism for a little while now.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it is like you go back and you remember these things that happened and you're like, wow, that really did happen. That was a thing. Like, I don't know, even just the other day I was thinking about it because I watched that new documentary about Britney Spears on Hulu. And I was like, oh, damn, like my junior high youth pastor really did call Britney Spears a tramp from the stage and have us to bring Britney Spears CDs to the youth group and trade them in for Christian CDs. Like that was a real thing that happened. And it's just, yeah, it's weird. It's sometimes weird to remember all of that. And you're like, I knew it was bad, but like, I'm not making it up. It's very weird.
Yeah, wasn't that the part of that whole narrative that Brittany and Justin supposedly were waiting till marriage, and then they were like, yeah, no. And then that's when Christian cancel culture came in and
canceled Brittany, even though like Justin is the one who has turned out to be like the worst, like I just, yeah, it's all misogyny.
Yeah. But I definitely remember that too, being like, and they weren't the first and they weren't the last, because I'm pretty sure they did the same thing to Miley Cyrus, because they put her on that same pedestal of purity, and then she became a person, like an adult person, and didn't fit into that box, and they did the same thing.
It's almost like when you put people on pedestals, it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
You alluded a little bit to how abuse can begin to enter into these spaces because of all of these things. So let's talk about that for a little bit, and how all of these theologies, all of these things that contribute to cultures of silence and local churches, and as well as in entire denominations, that hurt and cause abuse. Whenever things get sensitive, I get all kerfuffled. So
it's okay. It's hard to talk about it. It really is hard to talk about.
I'm just going to hand it over to you, and that is a very sort of open prompt. Yeah, let's start to segue to that even more difficult part, which is when the trust that is supposed to be in place in churches is betrayed in this way.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can say like purity culture upholds abuse, or purity culture leads to abuse in churches, but what do we really mean when we say that, right? So there's a few different, like, it's not like juggling, but there's just like stuff we got to hold at the same time, right? Okay. On one hand, no one, Christian church, school, Hollywood, Washington, no community anywhere is probably ever going to be able to stop like 100% of abusive behavior from happening. And that is because people who have a value system that includes abusing others are very tricky, and they're usually very charismatic, and they make people trust them, and they make people like them. And so I think it's a little overly simplistic to be like, well, so-and-so should have known, right? Now, I mean, people who behave in abusive ways are liars. and they are very tricky. And so there's a sense in which you will never be able to prevent 100% of abuse from happening in your community. And that's just a thing we have to be real about and be sad about and grieve. But that's the fact, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there are things that are risk factors for abuse. And there are things that are attractive to abusers. And there are things that, encourage is kind of like a mild word for it. There are ways we disciple men. There are ways we disciple men into abusive behavior. So I think in some ways, purity culture acts like one of those lamps that you put outside that attracts the mosquitoes and the moths. You know what I'm saying? I don't know what those are called, but it's like a little sign outside. I talk about this in the book about how it's just like a giant blinking vacancy sign outside your church, except for instead of vacancy, it says, you can find your next victim here and we probably won't call the police, right? So in this way, like, for example, having a whole youth group full of like young, impressionable kids who have not been given correct sex ed, who do not know names for their body, who do not know the word consent and know that they should be able to say yes and no to the sexual experiences that they do and don't want to have, who are ashamed of sex. Some of them are probably in the closet, don't have adults they can talk to because all the adults will only parrot back to them like the purity culture lines, right? You are fishing in a barrel if you're an abuser, right? In that situation. So there's that, right? I think a lot of the ways that purity culture shows up in churches attracts abusers to that community, right? There's also an internal component. This is what I mean by discipling, right? Like we disciple women to think that these abusive behaviors are like holy love. And this is my husband being like a good complementarian husband. And we disciple men into thinking that they should be in charge and they should get sex whenever they want it. And, all these things in a way, we're just sort of home growing our own abusers too, right? Because we're telling them like these abusive behaviors are actually like good and holy and like biblical, quote unquote, whatever that word means, right? So I think it's both. I think purity culture is attracting outsiders to the church in order to prey on people in the church. And I also think purity culture is growing its own abusers, in the basement, so to speak.
Yeah. That's nervous laughter. I'm not. It's because I'm not sure how to segue away from that.
Yeah. No, it's like, it really sucks. So yeah.
That's the thing about conversations like this, about books like yours, and just about this moment in history. People that came from these communities, people that are still in these communities, you have to sit in these sorts of moments and let that information, sit with you in your body and hold it for a little bit, because the reason why we're here, the reason why your work is necessary is because it's been ignored for so long. I am curious about a few different audiences for your book that you hope to speak to and what you hope that they take away. The first being survivors of this type of abuse. The second being church leaders or other types of people who may be working with these sorts of issues that they just have to face. And then the third being people like Amy who are in positions where they can provide counseling. So let's start with the survivors and how we can, even in conversations like this, even as these conversations are driven by books like yours, how can we keep survivors in mind while we discuss and think about these issues?
That's a great question. And I think it's a great question because people freaking forget about survivors when talking about sexualized violence. They center so many other concerns and so many other people in the conversations outside of the survivors. And I'm like, if you are doing work around sexualized violence that does not center the survivors of that sexualized violence, like, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know if you're doing work around sexualized violence. Like, I think you're doing work around image management mainly, probably, Right.
I've seen, and I'm sure, you've gotten added so many times on Twitter that like you're targeting the church or you're persecuting the church.
I'm just not centering the church. Church views not being centered as being persecuted, but I didn't write a book that was going to be the most compelling thing to churches. I didn't sit down and think, how can I most get my message across to church leaders?
Right.
That's not what I was going for, because I don't think that is actually the most important thing in this conversation, right?
Right.
I am that little measuring stick on the roller coaster. You get up there and it's like, you must be this tall to ride. That's my book. I'm just saying this is the standard, right? You must be this tall to ride. That's it. You can't get mad at that if you're not tall enough, like the metaphor breaks down. But what I'm saying is that's what I view my role as, right? I didn't center the church because I didn't want to write here's how to be a less problematic church manual, because I don't actually, I am not personally invested in the life or death of the church. It's not probably one of the bigger questions that I spend time thinking about. I am thinking about survivors, right? So I'm like, I'm going to write a book that says what survivors need to be said, regardless of how the church feels about it. Because I think that, and this is kind of getting into the question of like marketing and branding and whatever, but like, I think that who you repel is just as important as who you attract. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about who we're attracting and not enough time thinking about who we're repelling. And that is another reason why I wrote the book the way that I did, is because I want to repel certain Christians. I want to repel certain churches. And I don't feel bad about that. I didn't write the book with an aim to have it be a thing where like your average church could do it for a book club and like feel good about themselves at the end. That's not the idea. Now, maybe there are some churches, I think there are some churches that are willing to do the work, but that's not the purpose of it. So yeah, I think I'm like, when I wrote this book, I was like, I'm going to do what I would have needed really, that's all. When it comes to my audience, it's just me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Like, it's just, yeah, I write for former versions of myself. And I continue to. And so I was like, I'm going to do what I would have needed. I'm going to do what the survivors that I currently know would have needed in situations like this. Like, yeah, people they really just forget about survivors. And I'm like, this is the whole point.
Amy, do you have any particular questions or things that you think would be helpful for different types of providers to have in mind when they're working with survivors of this type of abuse that takes place in religious contexts?
Yeah, I do. I think what I discovered along my way of schooling and getting into the field, and somebody having been grown up in the purity culture, with a purity culture background, is I would share with classmates or do presentations. I took a sex therapy class and talked about purity culture, and most people are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so I think my question is really, what would you want therapists, social workers, just people who are working with survivors to know about purity culture, church culture, and how that makes that experience unique for a survivor?
Yeah. So first of all, I would say that I would want those practitioners to know and to understand that purity culture specifically, and also just religion more broadly, is not morally neutral inherently, right? Like, purity culture sort of gets subsumed under like this category of like sincerely held religious beliefs or whatever, so it's like sort of rude to question it, right? Like if someone's like, I'm waiting till marriage, like, well, that's just is rude, right? Like, it's rude to feel weird about that. And so because these things end up kind of becoming like sort of sacrosanct, right? People tend to treat them like they are morally neutral. Like it's just another religious belief. It's just another, and it's like actually very deeply harmful. And not only is it harmful to the individual, but I would also want to, like, in a very real and like, I'm not trying to be like that guy in like the conspiracy meme where he's got all the things by like red string and he's pointing at it, but like in a very real way, like purity culture is part of the reason why we have Donald Trump. Like purity culture is the reason why we have this, like, the purity culture is the vehicle of the resurgence of like this white supremacist Christian right, because it is all about like this purity, right? And purity is like code. It's a dog whistle. It's a dog whistle for whiteness. And I go into this a little bit in the book as well. Not nearly a good book that I've been reading is Sarah Mosliner's Virgin Nation, about this a little bit. But so I do this in a very like kind of quick, half a chapter version at the beginning of the book. But it really is, it's very deeply tied to like white supremacy and Christian nationalism, and very connected to what we have going on politically, like on a national scale right now. People voted, I would say, this is my opinion, that most white Christians voted for Donald Trump because of racism. But the reason they said they voted for Donald Trump is because of abortion. And that is a big part of purity culture,
Yes.
right? Like abortion is connected to this conversation because with abortion comes like these questions of like, who is able to reproduce? Who, like are the people that we want to reproducing? I mean, we're really getting into like eugenics type of conversations, right? All of this. So yes, like the red strings and the paper and the conspiracy or whatever, but like, it's real. All of these things are very connected. And so yeah, that's what I would want people to know. It's not morally neutral. It's a very big deal. It's very connected to what's going on politically on a national scale for us currently in this moment. And it may be going away. Gen Z is experiencing purity culture in a different way than I did. So it's a different thing, but it has not petered out yet. It is still around. I think millennials are probably uniquely traumatized by it because it was the height of it. It was the heyday when we were kids.
Yep.
Yeah.
But it's not gone away yet. It's still around. It's a very, very real threat to not just like national well-being, but also people's, interpersonal healing. So
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about healing, one thing I really enjoyed about the book is it's one thing to just talk about and kind of expose the system that is broken and problematic. But then you also, you move into the space of, okay, this has happened. And now what can I do, or what can we do? And I'd love for you to talk more about, just the healing piece and what you've discovered in your own journey and what you would want to others to know.
Yeah. So, I think it sounds a little cliche, but I do think that like the healing journey is different for everyone, right? I can't take my healing journey and then superimpose it onto you, and say, this is how your healing journey also needs to go. Right? I'm in seminary right now. I'm literally getting a master's degree in Christian theology. Some people need to never darken the doors of a church again. Some people need to not be a part of any kind of organized religion whatsoever, or find a completely different religion, or what, there's so many different options. It's just, it's one of those things that you can only describe and never prescribe for people. Mm-hmm. And so all you can really do is share your stories. All you can really do is share your narratives in this. And so in the book, I sort of go into this. I was like, this is how I have found healing. I have gone to therapy. I have reconnected with my body. Some of my healing was like, I realized I got connected with my body, and my body was like, you need to get a divorce and be with women. And I was like, well, that sucks. But I did it, and so it really is this, it's very personal. It's very personal. And so there are broad brushstrokes though, right? You can go, okay, therapy, as we know, is a privilege for a lot of people. And it's not as accessible as it should be. It's not as accessible as I wish it was. But therapy can be a really big part of that for a lot of people. There is also, you don't have to run a marathon or anything, but you do have to get back in your body.
Yeah.
You do have to you gotta, even if you just want to sit in a chair and do chair yoga, but you have to move your body. You have to get back into it. You can do breathing exercises. You can do whatever it is that gives you life and makes you feel good. But you have to do something. You can't, because there's so much about purity culture specifically and Western Christianity generally that really demonizes the body. Mm-hmm. Right. And this goes, this is why it's sort of hard sometimes to have conversations about the Bible for me, because I'm like, we can do all of this work to talk about like why this or that verse in the Bible doesn't necessarily mean like XYZ thing. And it probably doesn't, because Greek is complicated. But like at the end of the day, Christianity has never been particularly sex positive. Like Christianity has always had a trouble with the body. And so you have to reconnect with the body. That's not optional. You just have to. So there's artistic outlets. There's all kinds of different things that you can do to start that journey for yourself, to continue that journey for yourself. So broad brushstrokes, but individual journey.
It feels as relevant as ever. It doesn't feel like none of these concerns are going away.
Well, and that's what's wild about it in the pandemic. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought, maybe it'll be a quiet year. But no, it is not a quiet year. And we have had just as many instances of abuse and sexualized violence come out this year as any year before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The ones that are getting attention, I mean, we can date this. This podcast is being recorded on March 5th of 2021, and we're still getting reports about Carl Lentz and other things that happen at Hillsong. You quote others that have happened in the last few years regarding Hybels. Mm-hmm. It's not limited to evangelical spaces, even though evangelicalism is a particular hotbed of this. Nonetheless, it is something that is present everywhere and feels, as like I said, as relevant as ever. How do you envision the future of this type of work, of your own work, of the fact that this remains such a powerful vehicle for people to share their stories, to connect with other survivors, for people to be able to challenge the teachings that they've been given? There's so many elements to purity culture itself, and it feels like the response to it may need to be just as complicated. Yeah. Like Gen Z is experiencing it differently, but there are some accounts on Instagram that surface like all these purity culture TikToks that happen now. Mm-hmm. Of like,
oh my goodness, yeah.
It's so wild to me.
I'm not on TikTok.
But yeah, these are just things that I see that people take, and there's all this purity culture stuff that's happening there. So given that these things are so, purity culture itself is resilient, the response to it has to be resilient too. How do you see your role in continuing these types of conversations?
Yeah. So I have been dreaming about this lately because like the book was my focus for so long. I was like, I just got to get this book out. Right. Like, and that's when you're writing a book, like that's just what you have to focus on. You're like, all I care about is like getting these words written. Mm-hmm. But yeah, now that the book is done and like about to be birthed into the world, I have been dreaming about that and about what it might look like to take, I on the one hand, I'm a very, very, very big believer as both a millennial and also like an early adopter of technology that like online or whatever, like is real life. Like what happens online is real life. It's not like, here's this like fake life and then we exit, the internet and like go back to our real lives. That's not real. And it's not even just because like I met my fiance on Twitter, right? Like, but I think that like what we do online has very real implications for real life. So it's not that I want to continue doing all of the things that Church 2 has done so far. Because I think some of it is like kind of amazing, like there was a time when you wouldn't get the entire board of a church to resign over a pastor's misconduct. But that time is not now. Now, I mean, the sun is kind of setting on the time when that was, common practice. And so I want to continue to do all the things that Church 2 has been doing. I've also been dreaming about what it would look like to, obviously we're in the pandemic, but in the after times, whenever we can all, be together physically again. I've been dreaming about what it would look like to like, what would like a Church 2 protest look like? Like, what would it look like to organize a conference that wasn't centered, that was about this topic, but not centered around like the assumption that the church should continue to exist? Like what would it look like to kind of produce these bodies of knowledge in like a physical, tangible way? And of course I want to write more books and stuff too, but yeah, those are things that I've been thinking about in this moment of like, how do we translate this off, because I think one thing is like, with some of these bigger, more well-known churches, they're very sensitive to bad press. And so Church 2 is particularly effective for like these bigger, more well-known churches, right? Because they see all this bad press on the internet and they're like, oh no. Less so for like smaller churches, for churches out in the middle of nowhere that no one's heard of. They don't really care if someone's talking negatively about them on Twitter. So I've also been thinking about, okay, how do we support victims in places where bad press is not a motivator? This sort of, so these are questions that I'm beginning to ask myself.
Yeah.
As we we're all sort of in a holding pattern right now, right? Because we can't go anywhere, we can't be around people, we can't do stuff. But as the pandemic, I don't know if it's ever going to come to a close, but as we are able to then be back out in the world again at some point, hopefully in the next year or so, I'm starting to think about these questions of what might that look like, and who can I partner with? Because a lot of times when you hear people say like, why is no one talking about this? Well, it's just people are talking about it. You're not listening, right? So I'm trying to think, who can I partner with that's like already doing this work? Like, how do we not reinvent the wheel in order to help folks? Those are all like conversations that I'm trying to have in community and also places like right here, which is amazing. So,
yeah. I'm excited for whatever comes next, and I'm excited for this book to come out in under a week now. We're talking again on the 5th. The book is called Church 2, How Purity Culture Upholds Abuse and How to Find Healing, and it comes out on March 9th. The book will be out by the time you listen to this, so please go out to your local bookstore if you have one of those and are able to visit it safely.
People have told me they call their local bookstore and ask them to order it, and they do. So if you ask nicely, your local bookstore will probably order it, and that is preferable to lining the pockets of Jeff Bezos.
That's right. And you'll also find links to the bookshop.org in the show notes for this episode as well. Emily, thank you so much for joining me, and Amy as well. Emily, where can people find you online?
Yes. So I am at Emily Joy Poetry on Twitter and Instagram. You can follow me there. I have a website. It's emilyjoypoetry.com. It's very out of date because I'm launching a book and I'm a full-time grad student and I'm planning a wedding. So I only have time for like so many things. But yeah. You can read my old stuff there. And there's like a booking form and all that type of stuff. I know we're in the pandemic, but I will still come like virtually to your school, your conference, any type of virtual things you might be doing. emilyjoypoetry.com, and then just at Emily Joy Poetry on the social medias.
Amy, thank you for joining as well. Where can people find information about your firm in the Kansas City, Missouri area?
Well, you can Google me, Amy Congdon, and I'm on Psychology Today. I'm on Twitter as well at AE Congdon, and I believe my information is there too. And yeah, that's probably the easiest way.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining me today to talk about Emily's book and this topic in general. This is a really great conversation, and I can't wait for people to hear it.